Hello, and welcome to week 3 of Human Rights. This week we will be talking about NGOs, non-government organisations. This topic relates directly to paragraph 4 in your essay. Today we will be talking about what is an NGO, how do you determine what is an NGO in Australia, what are the advantages and disadvantages of NGOs, and we'll be looking at some examples of NGOs. And then you will do a task in the book. An NGO is any non-profit voluntary citizens group which is organised on a local, national or international level. There are many types of NGOs. Salvation Army, for example. Amnesty International is another example. The Red Cross is yet another example of an NGO. Now, you can't just form an organisation and declare yourself to be an NGO. To become an NGO in Australia, you have to meet certain criteria in terms of finances and purpose of the organisation and relationships you have. For example, you can't be a political party and an NGO because you have an ulterior motive, for example. Also, if you are an NGO in Australia, you're actually also considered to be a charity, which means you have certain tax advantages, namely that you don't pay tax. So the criteria to be regarded as an NGO in Australia is quite strict. So some of the criteria you have to meet are: you have to be registered with the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. You can't be included on various watch lists, including criminal and terrorist lists. And you have to demonstrate a minimum 2-year track record of managing development activities. Now, there is a commission, the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, which determines whether an organisation meets these criteria. So while I was researching this particular topic, I came across the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission, and I came across this controversy about Gary Johns, who is now the commissioner or the person in charge of the commission. And Mr. Johns is a very interesting man. He was appointed by Malcolm Turnbull. He's a former member of the ALP, and he was a member of Parliament for the Labor Party. And then after he lost his seat, he became a member of the IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs. And he became quite conservative. The Institute of Public Affairs, for those who don't know, is a lobby group, and they're not an NGO. They're a lobby group for the Liberal Party and for a very conservative branch of the Liberal Party. Mr. Johns also writes for Quadrant, which is a magazine that is also well known as a conservative voice. So even when we come to talk about charities and not-profit organisations and NGOs, there is a political aspect to it. On the Moodle, I have put a link to something Mr. Johns has written about Indigenous people, which is quite interesting and shows where his sympathies lie. So some of the advantages to being an NGO are that you are not aligned to any country. So in theory, NGOs are independent politically, and they don't have a political agenda. They also don't push the foreign policy of any particular nation. So you'll find with most NGOs, they are, for example, Amnesty International. So Amnesty doesn't identify with one particular country. and therefore they cannot be accused of pushing the agenda of that particular country. Now, some of the weaknesses of NGOs is that some of them are criticised for being culturally specific, particularly NGOs that focus on advocating for human rights, because sometimes it's seen that they are pushing a Western liberal or a Western progressive agenda. They also rely on donations, and there could occasionally be a perception that they are doing the will of their largest donors. And of course, as with most large organisations, there are questions about where does the money go, in terms of does it fund the bureaucracy, or does the money go to where the NGO says the money is supposed to go. So for example, a company like World Vision, an NGO like World Vision, there have been accusations that the money given to World Vision is squandered in the administration tasks and that it doesn't go directly to the people that World Vision say it's going to help. So let's turn to look at some examples of non-profit organisations. And because we are talking about international human rights in this session, I'm going to be talking about international human rights organisations. And three examples, which most people will know, would be the Red Cross, Amnesty International, and Médecins Sans Frontières. All three have branches in Australia. So firstly, we're going to look at Amnesty. Amnesty says we're independent of any political ideology, economic interest, or religion. We are a diverse and democratic movement of people who demand dignity, freedom, justice, and equality for all. Amnesty is primarily concerned with human rights issues. They are more of a lobby group. They work in terms of gathering signatures on petitions, letter writing campaigns. They do investigations of issues, and they write reports about those issues. You can have a look at the Amnesty website and you can see a bit more about how they work. So some of Amnesty's major issues have been things like the death penalty, campaigning against the death penalty, campaigning for LGBTQI rights, things like that. That they are the sort of things that Amnesty is concerned with. They don't do a lot actually on the ground. They do a lot of campaigning and lobbying about these issues. Another well-known NGO is the International Red Cross and Red Crescent. The ICRC is an independent, neutral organisation ensuring humanitarian protection and assistance for victims of armed conflict and other situations of violence. It takes action in response to emergencies and at the same time promotes respect for international humanitarian law and its implementation in national law. Now, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent are very much a hands-on organisation. They do things like set up refugee camps. They're on the ground supporting people who are victims of war, basically. Now, it's the International Red Cross and Red Crescent because the Red Cross is a Christian symbol. The cross is a Christian symbol, of course. So in non-Christian countries, the Red Crescent can be more well recognised and more acceptable. Both organisations do a lot of work with victims of war. That is basically their primary purpose. They also write reports about the situation of people who are victims of war, and they lobby the UN and other government organisations about these situations. So that's just a little bit of a background about non-government organisations, what they are, how we determine what a non-government organisation is in Australia, and some examples of non-government organisations, Amnesty and the Red Cross and Red Crescent. So your task this week is to choose an NGO from the list in your booklet and fill out the table on page 35. So just pick one and fill out the information about that NGO. Knowing about NGOs is important because you can use that information in paragraph 4 of your essay. I hope you've enjoyed this week's lecture and I'll see you next week. Any questions? Just email me at leanne.richards@gmail.com. Thank you. Goodbye.